Hi, I'm Audible Editor Courtney Reimer, and I'm here today with author Michael Pollan, who you may know from works such as How to Change Your Mind, The Omnivores Dilemma, and In Defense of Food, which starts with the now iconic line, "Eat food, not too much, mostly plants." Today we'll be talking to him about his new Audible original, Caffeine, How Caffeine Created the Modern World, which could potentially begin, drink coffee, not too much, mostly decaf. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Courtney. Good to be here.
So you've written about nature, food, psychedelic drugs. Why did you choose caffeine next?
Well, I've always been interested in plants and our relationship to plants and how plants use our desires to advance their own interests. So the plants that evolved to feed us have done very well in the world. Think of corn and rice and wheat. But we use plants for a lot of different things. And one that I've always been very curious about is this desire we have to change consciousness, which a select handful of plants are very good at helping us to do. And and I've written about cannabis, I've written about opium, I've written about psilocybin, and I'm curious about that desire. Why should people want to change consciousness? But I'm also curious about how the plants evolved to figure that out. And the ones that figured that out have thrived. And staring me right in the face was the one that most of us are involved with every day, and that's coffee and tea. And I had never written about them. And they do change our consciousness, but it's so pervasive that it's invisible to most of us. But it's the baseline for most people. So I thought, it's really time I look at this whole relationship between us and these two plants and this amazing little molecule that has 90% of people on Earth pretty much addicted.
Yeah, myself included.
Yeah, myself included too.
And we talk about that, and you talk about that a bit in your book, but talk to me a little bit about, sort of how maybe your last work of really diving into what I call sort of experiential writing or experiential
or immersive journalism.
Yeah.
It's funny, it's been an important part of my work since the beginning. And when it came to writing about psychedelics, I realized at some point there was really no good way to convey the experience to readers without having it myself. And it's something that I realize in retrospect I learned from a book that my parents gave me when I was like 13, Paper Lion by George Plimpton. And he was a terrific sports writer and editor of the Paris Review. And he was kind of tired of the conventions of sports writing, which are very much all written from the same sideline or press box, cigar chomping, been there, done that, cynical, skeptical point of view. And he thought, what if I could actually get on the field and write about football from the perspective of a quarterback in the game? And he persuaded the Detroit Lions to let him go through summer training camp and actually start in an exhibition game in September. And you get a point of view on football that no football player could give you, because for them it's been routine since they were little kids, but that only somebody who is a great observer and a great storyteller having the experience for the first time, and it just lights up the page. And I love that book. And in retrospect, I realized that's had a profound influence on me.
It's funny, that was the name I was looking for, and the term is participatory journalism, right?
That's right.
And that's what I thought about in listening to your past two works, is that you really participate in things like even quitting caffeine is a pretty major thing to do in the name of research.
Well, it was, and I wasn't eager to do it because I love my cup of coffee in the morning, and it's so woven into the process of not only waking up and greeting the day for me, but writing. There's always some kind of cup of caffeine next to me, whether it's tea or coffee. And I couldn't imagine getting anything done without it. And but it was actually, in this case, it wasn't my idea. It was one of the researchers I was interviewing. Roland Griffith is kind of the leading caffeine researcher. He's also the leading psychedelic researcher, interestingly enough. So I knew him already from How to Change Your Mind. And as I started interviewing him, I had a series of interviews with him. He said, you're never really going to understand your relationship to this drug, and it is a drug, unless you get off it. And so I took his challenge, and it was very hard to do. It felt like I had ADD. I knew what ADD, attention deficit disorder, was really like, which is to say all these distractions from the periphery kept coming into the center of my attention, and I couldn't achieve that kind of spotlight consciousness that you really need to write. So yeah, it was one of the bigger sacrifices I made in the name of journalism.
And I guess we're wondering, are you back on it?
So I got off caffeine for 3 months. I was only drinking, I continued to drink hot liquid in the form of herbal tea, chamomile tea, mint tea, ginger tea, things like that. And I wanted to get it totally out of my system and see if I could write a lot of this piece without caffeine, which ultimately I was able to do. But I also wanted to get back on and have a cup after that and describe that experience, because people who've been drinking caffeine routinely for most of, a period of decades or most of their lives have no idea what a powerful drug it is until you get off and get back on. It's almost worth getting off to have the experience of that first cup. And that first cup was kind of mind-blowing. And it made me realize this is a powerful drug. But most of us don't realize that because we use caffeine once you're addicted in a different way, which is essentially to stop withdrawal. And that feels good too, because withdrawal feels so bad. But just as every morning when you wake up, overnight, the caffeine is being metabolized out of your system, and you wake up, and all those people who say, I can't talk to anybody till I have a cup of coffee. I can't do anything till I have a cup of coffee. They're at the beginning of withdrawal, and it doesn't feel good. You feel kind of muzzy-headed. You might have a headache. You just feel removed and unclear. And there's a fog. There's a fog that every morning we dispel with that first sip of caffeine. And so that's kind of how we're using it. But if you're a caffeine virgin or a restored caffeine virgin, which is what I was, it really hits you hard. And it was fantastic. And that first cup. And I thought to myself, I wonder if there's a way I could preserve this power and use it sort of the way people use psychedelics who use them, which is only every now and then with a real sense of intention and occasion. And could I do that with caffeine rather than slipping back into the usual habit? And I resolved at that point that I would just use it on Saturdays and see how that goes. And that's kind of where I am now. I have a cup of coffee every Saturday, but that Saturday cup, you should see me on Saturdays.
I was very struck by your ability to sort of access the effects that it had on you and articulate them. And it did remind me of how you were able to do that with How to Change Your Mind. And I wondered if your experience with that helped you better access.
Without doubt. I mean, my experience with psychedelics presented this huge literary challenge, which was, how do you describe a psychedelic trip to someone who hasn't had one? And people don't understand, what is a hallucination? Are you completely lost to it, or do you still have some grounding in reality? And once I found a voice in which to do it, or a way to get it across, I found I really enjoyed describing states of consciousness. So yeah, I want to do more of that. I mean, I'm just very interested in consciousness in general, and why we want to change it. What does that do for us? In the case of caffeine, you can see what it does for us. It's an amazing drug in that it gives you energy without calories, and it's had a tremendous effect on civilization. It's really changed the world.
I wanted to talk a bit about that. I mean, you talk about both your ability as a writer to being hampered a bit by the absence of caffeine, but talk to me a little bit about how, I found it interesting what you learned in your research about like Parisian influential writers like Balzac, and how caffeine / the coffee houses influenced sort of the artistic revolution there, but then also how caffeine...
And scientific revolution.
And also industrial and capitalism. Yeah. I mean, not to go all into it, but I don't think people realize the role that caffeine has played in all of those various touch points.
I certainly didn't. I had no idea what a profound effect it had. What's interesting about caffeine is it doesn't show up in the West, in Europe, until the 1650s. when caffeine shows up, you see a real change in the texture of work and the texture of thought. You mentioned Balzac. I mean, he was a major caffeine addict. He got to the point where he didn't even want to dilute coffee with water. He would just eat the grounds on an empty stomach. And it would keep him up all night. And he was an incredibly productive novelist. And he believed that his imagination depended on this stimulus.
There are two things I want to talk to you about. One being, you can overdo it, which we can talk about, but also sort of what you explored with your wife in terms of like how our addiction to caffeine, by our, I mean like Western civilization, has affected the places where the root of it, literally. Can you talk to me a bit about like sort of that dark side of coffee that people, or caffeine?
I mean, there's a couple dark side. There is no free lunch, right? I mean, the blessings of coffee and tea are achieved on the backs of some, pretty horrible exploitation. Most of the caffeine comes from plants that are grown in the tropics mostly and consumed in the global north. And there has been a history of exploitation and slavery. I mean, the coffee plantations in South America especially were run by slaves. And climate change is going to be a disaster for coffee. The biggest threat to our addiction to coffee is climate change. By 2050, it's estimated that 50% of the coffee growing regions of the world will no longer be suitable for growing coffee. It grows in a very narrow band environmentally. So coffee may become, as it was in the 1650s, a very precious luxury good.
When I heard that in your piece, I actually did the mental math of how old will I be when caffeine is basically extinct? And how will I survive? So as a fellow addict, that really struck me.
We'll probably move to synthetic caffeine, right? I mean, it'll be invented in a lab and people will take pills when coffee becomes hard to get. But then you lose the culture of coffee, which is so beautiful. I mean, it isn't just a drug. I mean, it is an experience. It's a set of aromas. It's a set of flavors. It's a set of social practices.
I have a theory, and I wonder, this is me talking, you're the expert here, but about the rise of anxiety and the rise of coffee culture. Do you think there's a tie there?
We're not drinking that much more coffee than we were a couple decades ago. There's so many causes for anxiety now, and coffee may abet it and make it worse. And also the kind of coffee we were drinking pre-1970s, it was actually higher in caffeine. We were drinking Robusta coffee, which is a kind of bean that was mostly grown in Brazil. So the move toward better quality coffee, which we really have Alfred Peet of Peet's Coffee to thank. He was the guy, he was a Dutch son of a coffee roaster, and he actually taught the guys who started Starbucks. They went and interned with him, and he was very generous with his knowledge. And he begins this coffee revolution to higher quality coffee that is now our coffee culture. I mean, American coffee was really pretty undrinkable, and I can remember that crappy coffee. But whether it made us more anxious, I don't know. I think you'd have to first prove that there was, we were getting more caffeine rather than less. But I think the bigger problem that coffee consumption is contributing to is probably our sleep deficit. We're in a kind of vicious circle with coffee. I mean, we're sleep deprived. So what do? Drink more coffee. Why are we sleep deprived? Because we're drinking a lot of coffee.
I mean, we hear about how sleeplessness is creating almost as many like car accidents as drunk driving. I don't have the exact numbers, but I know that it is a pretty major problem. On balance, do you think that the good coffee and caffeine have brought to us is, in the end, would you say, like, I don't want to spoil the whole listen for people here, but where do you net out on this? Is caffeine good or bad?
I would say on balance, it's positive. I would say that it has given us more than it's taken. There are also a lot of health benefits to coffee and tea consumption. I was very struck by that. People have been because people enjoy coffee so much, we assume that there's something really evil about it. There has to be. It just can't be that simple. And people have been searching for health problems to associate with caffeine since the 1650s. But in recent years, they have looked at heart disease, they've looked at cancer, they've looked at Parkinson's, and guess what? Coffee consumption and tea consumption to a certain extent are protective against several kinds of cancer, protective against Parkinson's disease, and protective against cardiovascular disease. That's quite remarkable. The health picture is not only neutral, it's pretty positive. The one negative is the sleep question, that it erodes not always the quantity, but the quality of our sleep. There's something you need that's called slow wave or deep sleep. And people who are drinking coffee or tea have diminished amounts of this slow wave sleep. It stays in your system a very long time. The quarter life of caffeine is about 12 hours. What that means is if you drink a cup of coffee at noon, at midnight, a quarter of that caffeine is still circulating in your brain.
But I think the good news is for those listening to this because they are themselves caffeine addicts or at least connoisseurs, however they want to spin it for themselves, is that you don't have to cut it out entirely. You can.
No, and there's an argument for ending your caffeine use early in the day. And for people who want to get off it, you can taper and get off it, without that much trouble. Going cold turkey the way I did is really hard. But this is not, this story is not about coffee up and down. There are lots of people who, like, when I've told them I'm writing about caffeine, they're like, all right, bottom line, what is it, up or down? Right. It's that. Which is much more interesting than the simple up or down. It's been a wonderful boon to our civilization and to many of us as individuals. Is there some price that we pay? Yeah, as always, there's a trade-off. But, we have to weigh things. Life is complicated. I move toward, I'm very comfortable in ambiguity in my writing. And so if people shouldn't listen to this just for the bottom line, good or bad. It's a much more interesting and complicated story than that.
And I really do appreciate the nuance you bring to this story, not just as a caffeine lover, but as somebody who loves the kind of work you do. So thank you.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I don't write things you can put on an index card.
I appreciate that. That's why we listen.
The journey is the pleasure, not the destination.
Very much. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.